You're listening to the SoleStrategies podcast hosted by the team here at SoleStrategies. We hope you like the latest episode and thanks for tuning in.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the SoleStrategies podcast. We've been taking a brief hiatus, but we've kind of reorganized a little bit. So today, official announcements, I think, are due. I'm your co-host, James Ray, and we now have another co-host, Josh Willis. So this is going to be a fun podcast for a number of reasons. When we initially started this, kind of the planning for this episode, we were initially going to be going into a series of topics. But today's news actually has kind of overridden any kind of plan that we had. So today we're going to be talking about the recent news of Joe Manchin functionally killing the Build Back Better plan and what this kind of like militant moderacy in the Democratic Party indicates for the future health of the Democratic Party going into 22 and 2024. So, Josh, if you want to get us started, how's the morning been?
Well, honestly, I can say, James, like when I woke up this morning and I kind of rolled out of bed, checked Twitter, saw the news, it was simultaneously the most and least surprising thing I've ever seen. I think that a lot of us have been waiting for Joe Manchin to like make that official announcement for a while. I think a lot of us saw him kind of sapping Build Back Better for months and months now of any progressive facet of anything that could have been, any crumb that he could have given to the working people of this country. We kind of saw that coming. I was a little bit taken aback, I think, early on about the whole, oh, so we're going to let Joe Manchin run the country now. That's the play we're running. And as slowly over time, it became more and more apparent that that's exactly what was going on, that there was going to be absolutely zero legitimate repercussions for Joe Manchin, and to a lesser extent, but also a very prominent extent, Kyrsten Sinema, right? There was going to be very little repercussions for them kind of taking the power that the Democrats worked very hard to win. We'll talk about that later. The power that they worked very hard to win by taking the Senate, effectively clinching them the White House and both houses of Congress, right? Taking that power and effectively nullifying it completely. So that bit of it was a little surprising early on, but I guess this morning when I saw the news and I was like, all right, Joe Manchin officially announced that he's not voting for Build Back Better, which effectively kills, the centerpiece of Joe Biden's platform. I wasn't really surprised, but I figured, it just happened this morning. We may as well come up and talk about it because it's a pretty substantial microcosm of this presidency thus far. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it before we really dive deeper into it.
So on my end, like I had a few initial thoughts. One was I was less surprised at the action and more surprised that people were at all surprised about it. Manchin has, for pretty much since the beginning of his entire leadership. I mean, I'm calling it leadership because I think functionally he is in control of the Senate. Since the beginning of his tenure, I suppose, he has been determined to be like a very, very moderate force that kind of opposes any even remotely progressive reforms or policies or changes or what have you. And, Manchin's biggest sticking point in the infrastructure negotiations were the social spending components of the Build Back Better plan. So for me, the minute that Democrats decided to separate the infrastructure spending package from the Build Back Better plan vote, that's about all I needed to know that Build Back Better was functionally dead. Because you've just eliminated the one leverage point that you really had in these negotiations from being on the table. And now you have a very moderate Democrat, functionally, in my opinion, a conservative, who is now just going to vote the way that he wants to vote because there's no reason for him not to. He's passed the infrastructure component that he can now go home to his constituents and say, hey, I gave you better roads or what have you. But he now also gets to say, and I also was able to trim the fat functionally, right? I was able to stop this social spending stuff from getting done. Aren't I a great moderate? Can you please vote for me again? And that's kind of going to be the strategy that he's going to employ. And it's the strategy that he's been employing for the longest time is how can I get crumbs to take back to my constituents without giving anyone the whole pie? And I don't know, like it's just been surprising to me that people were so surprised about it, but it didn't really surprise me that it happened. Because this is pretty textbook Manchin, in my opinion. I don't know. What do you think?
I would agree with that. I think that it's pretty interesting how Manchin is kind of now, as he's stepped into the national spotlight. I mean, he's become a household name because of this. I think that effectively driving all Democratic policy, right? By voting down or saying he's not going to vote for certain aspects of Democratic policy. He's taken this stance as kind of the kind of rare, I feel like, deficit hawk Democrat, where he's really attached himself to, you know, those Republican talking points we see so often, right? Whenever Congress has to pass, you know, billions upon billions upon billions upon trillions of dollars worth of military spending, there is never once a talk about the deficit. The deficit only gets brought up when we're talking about policies that could impact like working Americans, policies that can impact just Americans across the board, right? We're talking, you know, infrastructure is one of them, like more legitimate infrastructure. We talk about social safety nets. We talk about like medical care. All of that stuff that's when you get into the weeds. That's when these deficit hawks kind of come crawling out of the woodwork, right? And that's kind of something Joe Manchin has now attached himself to. Joe Manchin is very much so the textbook deficit hawk Democrat, and that's the thing is, yeah, he got to take exactly what you said. He gets to go home and he gets to say like, look, I got the infrastructure, but also the deficit. And on a personal level, I've always been kind of you know, what is a working class American, you know, in middle America, you know, puts their pants on one leg at a time. Like, what do they really care for the deficit, other than what they've been told they have to care for the deficit, right? Because at the end of the day, the deficit only matters when blocking policy that's going to help regular Americans. And that's kind of been the thing for Joe Manchin, right? Is he's effectively used that messaging to now kill the most the centerpiece of Joe Biden's presidential policy, essentially sticking hard line to that messaging. I do think it's pretty textbook Manchin. Like I said, I was only surprised in the very beginning that the Democrats were going to absolutely let him run it, because it did seem, not that this is out of touch with what we've seen in the past from the Democratic Party as a whole, and I can get into that a little bit later. I have a certain theory about that, but more so just after the absolute dogfight that the Democrats put up in Georgia, right? Putting the entirety of the national Democratic machine into 2 Senate races, because they knew that if they secured both Senate races, Raphael Warnock, John Ossoff, if they were to both win, that would effectively give them the majority in all houses of office, right, at a federal level. And the absolute fight that they put into that, it seemed like maybe they might actually, like, you know, try to work something out here. And they put in all that effort only to have a senator from, you know, West Virginia, and to a lesser extent a senator from Arizona shoot it down. So it's kind of incredible how the Democrats kind of folded on that. But other than that, not at all surprised by the news. It seemed like Joe Manchin was pretty much doing this the whole time. This is now just the official nail in the coffin, as it were.
Hey, you're listening to the SoleStrategies podcast. Take a moment to listen to some of our esteemed champions and their takeaways from the program.
And I'm glad that I was a part of that I had the opportunity to even be involved with that, with some legitimate organizations that help people who want to do right by other people, you know, by communities.
You know, utilize my resources, utilize my networks. The last month, I've had some tremendous things happen.
It's your time to become a leader. Go to SoleStrategies.com to find out more.
No, I completely agree. And it you know, it's only compounded by the unfortunate reality that the Biden administration, it seems, didn't really care, I think, all that much about what was literally the centerpiece of their administration. Beyond infrastructure, I don't know how badly Biden actually cared. There doesn't seem to be that much evidence that he did. And, in the last week, even before this official news, we had seen such a quick pivot to like emphasis on voting rights legislation over the over the triple B, that I really, in my opinion, as soon as I saw Biden rhetorically shift really heavily towards voting rights legislation, in my head, I said, oh, that's not a good sign. Because he's completely shifting messaging and he's shifting focus, right? Which means that bill is either secured or dead on arrival. And it appears, unfortunately, that it was the latter rather than the former. But I mean, that's, like, as much as we say textbook Manchin, that's also textbook Biden. Like, his administration has had little to no actual cohesive plans. They've gotten, not even, in my opinion, really even the bare minimum done to expect good electoral results in 22 and 24. And even within the office of the president, the executive powers that he has personally, that he hasn't made movement on like significant bills, or significant pieces of legislation. So, I mean, we're in this, like, unfortunately, we're in this position where, with Biden kind of, not really being the, I hate using this word, not really being the strong leadership that that you would need to bully more moderate elements into the fold. He's rolling over for people like Manchin, people like Sinema and others in such a way that gives them ridiculous institutional power, despite the fact that, like, Manchin's district is not really at all representative of the national, model. Manchin is in a really conservative district, and just kind of skirts by, and he's controlling policy. And that's like kind of the unfortunate part of the Senate right now is, like you said, even though we made massive gains in Georgia, it looks like that didn't play out to any like functional gains for the American people. And I can't help but fear that that's going to reflect very, very poorly in 22 and 24, when I think Democrats inevitably lose the Senate and probably see a slimmer House majority than they already have. I don't think Democrats lose the House, but I think in 2022, in November, they're going to probably lose the Senate. And then in 24, I can't imagine the Biden administration being a two-term presidency personally.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I think that, like you said, the pivot from Biden to voting rights, and the pivot we've seen, not just from Biden, but obviously when Biden leads, the moderate cohort kind of follows, which is like the majority of Democrats in office follow to shifting their talk about Build Back Better to now talking about voting rights legislation. That did signal the beginning of the end for Build Back Better. It seemed like a couple of days ago that went going on, like that messaging started. And once that messaging started, you're essentially setting the countdown clock, because they know that Joe Manchin is going to announce he's not voting for Build Back Better, and they're trying to get out ahead of it. So that was the signifier that this was over. Joe Biden effectively abandoning the centerpiece, like I said, the centerpiece of his administration, right? This is his magnum opus. This is his big piece of legislation that he was trying to pass, the Build Back Better plan. It is named after it's effectively like the same as Trump naming a bill the Make America Great Again plan, right? Build Back Better was essentially his Make America Great Again. It was his tagline. It was his signifier the entire race, right? When he started to take over, essentially allowing it to die. He abandons it. Joe Manchin shoots it down. Joe Biden, not effective at all at using his power as the president to tell Joe Manchin, listen, I am the head of your party and you have to do what I tell you, because I am the president here. You're not the president. You weren't elected president. You are effectively shooting our administration in the back. You are shooting Americans in the back. None of that happened. And the pivot to voting rights effectively announced an abandonment of Build Back Better. And then you get into kind of the messaging that we've been seeing from progressives across the board, which is, I didn't know that Build Back Better and voting rights were mutually exclusive. I thought that we could fight for both, which is the reality. I don't understand using voting rights as we have to focus on voting rights. It's like, yeah, but we can also focus on Build Back Better. they're essentially using the protection of voting rights as kind of like the, hey, look what we got over here, like we got voting rights. They're trying to detract away from the fact that their centerpiece is being demolished and killed right in front of our very eyes after they fought for it, right? And at every pass, Joe Manchin and Sinema to a lesser extent were willing to say, we're not voting for this, take this part out, we're not doing this, we're not doing that. So the abandonment, the wholesale abandonment of Build Back Better in favor of voting rights has been something that's increasingly frustrating for the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is looking at it like, why don't we do both? I don't understand why we can't do both, right? And that's kind of been something that has been the talk of the week, right? Is I think a lot of progressives saw what was coming when that pivot happened and trying to get out the messaging that, like, look, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't need to just abandon Build Back Better in support of the voting rights, of increasing and protecting voting rights. We can do both. Don't let people tell you we can't. Effectively, that messaging didn't work, and the messaging from the presidency, obviously always stronger. He abandons it, basically rendering the Democrats kind of like out on their feet, for 2022. I think that I would agree with your assessment that 2022 is looking like it's going to be a real rough one for Democrats. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who tells you the opposite, right? I think a lot of people have seen what has been effectively an ineffective administration at dealing with the moment. And I think a lot of that comes down to they had lost control of Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who effectively were driving policy in the opposite direction of where most of the American populace wanted it. And that is going to render this administration completely out on their feet. 2022, I think, is going to be a mess for the Democrats. I would agree with your assessment that the Senate is all but gone. I think that there would have to be a turnaround of monumental proportions in the next year to keep them from losing the Senate. And I think everything we've seen from this administration and from this Congress, that I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think that that's likely. So I think that 2022 will see a lot of advances for Republicans, and like you said, it will leave them effectively out on their feet for 2024, when the Republicans are going to probably come in with a knockout blow and render the Biden administration a one-term presidency. Whether he runs again or whether they put up somebody else, I know there's been talk of Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg, another ticket that I do not see putting up any fight against a Republican ticket at this point in time, because I think a lot of people are going to see like the Democratic Party essentially backing down on most, if not all, of the policy that got them elected, leaving them completely vulnerable to yet another Republican majority in the coming years. So I think that that's a completely true assessment, is that the Democratic Party right now is kind of just wobbling. Like they're getting ready to take that big like left hook from the Republicans, and I think it's completely of their doing. I don't think that they honestly had such a lead, right? When they won the presidency, they secured the Senate and they secured the House, and they were riding high, and they essentially have shot themselves in the foot enough that now they're completely vulnerable to a big Republican wave.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, and that's the unfortunate reality too. I guess another really unfortunate reality of it too is that like the moderate base of the Democratic wing, I don't think seems to understand the ramifications of this decision making, because you are seeing a lot of rhetoric, especially from the more like moderate Democratic wing, who are like Biden's like actual primary supporters, who are saying that we can't really blame the Biden admin, we really can't blame all of this, because you have these two moderate senators who were kind of doing a lot of damage. And, I'm sympathetic to that, but there comes a time where, you have to ask yourself, it's like, this is an administration that, one, isn't even doing the small things that they could do within their own, like executive powers. You're talking like, just like the big three that I can think of that might actually get them some pretty good PR is, one, the cancellation of the student debt that was promised at the beginning of the Biden administration, as well as like other like, the legalization of marijuana, which was, I think, never really on the table for that admin, but could be supplemented in to at least help approval ratings a little bit. And, mixed with like also like, I don't know, maybe getting kids out of cages at the border, like you can do things like as an executive that, that you don't have to rely on the Senate for. And my fear is really going to be that, had Biden done a few of those things through executive orders, like you could have actually made a really cohesive argument in 22 and 24 that like the real problem is we don't have enough Democrats, in the Senate, which is true, in my opinion. The problem in the Senate fundamentally is that we don't have enough like progressives in the Senate. Like we have a couple of moderates who are functionally Republicans. And then you have like Cinema, who's just functionally bought out by whatever corporation she's talking to that week. So, you don't have any real institutional leverage beyond like maybe a few moderate policies. But there are things he could have done that he hasn't. And I think, come 2022, I don't see a lot of progressive voters and I really coming out and buying the whole like, oh, he couldn't have done anything. It's all the Senate. Because like an average voter is going to say he's the president. When he wants to move things, he can do that. Like you can utilize the bully pulpit as the president. You can really hold this to the flame or hold people to the flame, and you can really, really shape the national narrative if you want to. But it seems the Biden administration is almost hell-bent on doing nothing and seeing how well they can do electorally after doing that nothing. And I think, unfortunately, like Biden's supporters are reflective of Biden in that, like, he is convinced that this is a strategy that might work in 22 and 24. My unfortunate, my fear is that like the strategy that he thinks is working is actually going to blow up in everybody's faces. And we're going to end up with Republican leadership and a truncated government by 24. That's probably not going to get busted until minimum 28. So like, when we look at like the strategy of the Democratic Party, in the short term and I guess in the midterm, like, no pun intended. Biden had 2 years functionally to get done some of the core components of his agenda. And, I think in my opinion and the opinions of a lot of progressives who had seen his administration start was he needs to push things through in the first 2 years because even if he was doing well, I don't think Democrats were holding on to the Senate just because of like general midterm trends. Usually like in the next midterms, like the party of the incumbent president is disproportionately affected, right? And you're going to see losses of seats. And in a Senate where you literally only have the majority because of Kamala Harris, that presents a serious strategic problem. But I think anybody who is reasonable felt that, you have to get everything done by November 2022. And if you don't, those next 2 years are going to be really painful because now, ideally the Biden administration passed a few things early and then can pawn it off to the Senate after 22 and say, well, this is, we don't have the majority. We can't do anything. The typical like Democratic resistance energy. But, he hasn't done anything. So when he goes and tells everyone like, oh, there's so much I wish I could have done, people who are plugged in are calling bullshit functionally because like there are things he could have done. But he, as a president, decided not to do any of them when he had all of the leverage. And now we're all going to suffer because of that functionally.
No, I would agree with that. I think that you're seeing from, the administration as a whole, you're seeing an outright denial of the power that they have essentially forfeited to Joe Manchin. I think we saw it doing the rounds on Twitter. There was a video of Charlemagne the God interviewing Kamala Harris, in which he very bluntly asked Kamala Harris, who is the president, Joe Biden or Joe Manchin? And they rushed to cut the interview, and Kamala did get very angry because that is essentially how Americans are feeling. Americans that pay attention to the day in and day out are like, wait a second here. Like I voted for Joe Biden for president. I live in Kentucky. I did not vote for Joe Manchin. He wasn't on my ballot. So I think the frustration there is the frustration there is absolutely valid, right? It's also, I feel like we're kind of seeing this where they were promising the most progressive administration, and I think that a lot of us in the progressive wing, we kind of took that with a grain of salt, but we were at least expecting them to try to hold some bit of they're going to try to make that a little bit legitimate, right? They're going to try to add some legitimacy to that claim that they were saying this was going to be the most progressive administration in American history. Um, Ultimately, though, we are seeing a world where, effectively, imagine you're an American who doesn't pay much attention to politics day in and day out. All you know is who's president and what affects you directly, right? Biden has betrayed his platform so much that you are an American who voted for Joe Biden because you didn't really feel you kind of you're done with Trump, right, and all the shenanigans. So you're going through your day and day. You, as an American that doesn't really pay attention to politics, you have received more stimulus money under Donald Trump. You had your student debt payments paused under Donald Trump, effectively during a pandemic. And now, because the Biden administration is so set on kind of reinstituting normal, right? They want to bring back normal. They want to return to normalcy, right? They are essentially, they gave you a very small payment at the very beginning of the administration that was completely, it was completely chiseled down and trimmed down to next to nothing from what they promised during the Georgia elections, right? They promised everybody a significant amount of money, right, to win those Georgia elections, and then immediately turned away from those people and those promises that they made. And then you're also having a world where now your student debt payments are being reinstituted in the middle of a pandemic, right? It's kind of like this hypocrisy between the messaging that the Democratic Party is making on a wholesale scale, right? Where we're seeing the Omicron variant kind of cutting through communities, right? And it is very, very impactful. You're seeing hours-long lines at testing facilities in major cities across the country. And we are hearing rhetoric from the administration that the Omicron variant is something we did not see coming, but we need to do our best to combat this. Get vaccinated, get your booster. We need to combat this. We have to fight this, right? Because we are still very much in the midst of a pandemic. But then again, on the other hand, they're also kind of saying to Americans in their action, we had our student loan debt moratorium was instituted because there is a pandemic going on, and Americans are very much so living paycheck to paycheck, even more than they already were, and they do not need the extra financial stress of having to pay off their student debt. But we're reinstituting it now, even though they're telling you that the pandemic is still going on. So there is that mixed messaging that is absolutely confusing to most Americans, right? And to also touch on a point that you made of the further repercussions of the Biden administration's inability to meet the moment, and the electoral repercussions that we're probably going to see, as the progressive wing has seen time and time again, the messaging that is going to come out of a Republican beatdown that I think we're probably headed for because of the inability of this administration to meet the moment in the midterms, right? The messaging that's going to come out of that is the same messaging you get each and every time a moderate Democrat loses a seat. And it's going to be, we went too far left. And they're going to drive the issues further to the center or further to the right, depending on how you see things. That's kind of the messaging that is going to come out of this. And I do think that a Republican routing of the Democratic Party at the midterms is going to be immediately pinned on any and all progressive movement, progressive candidates, progressive activists, progressive voices, right? The progressive wing of the Democratic Party could mop up and they could win a ton of elections, right, in their own right. But if enough moderate Democrats lose their seats to Republicans, the messaging wholesale from the national level Democrats is going to be, we played too much into progressive policy, into progressive rhetoric, and we need to move further to the right. And that is the issue that we're probably headed for, and we see it each and every time. And I just, we got to wrap up soon, but your thoughts on that as we close out kind of this overview of the Joe Manchin administration that we have lived in for the last year.
I mean, I've already begun seeing it. And this is kind of probably one of the harshest effects of this kind of, like, again, militant moderacy of a certain part of the Democratic Party, is you have a few moderates who are holding everything back because of their, they're already either moderate, not really districts, but I guess like areas that they're relying on. Manchin, again, is in, I said moderate district. As a senator, he's just in a very moderate state. He's in a very conservative situation. So he's not going to be having a very fun time. Should progressive legislation go through, but at some point you have to play that, you have to have that calculus. It's like, do we lose Manchin or do we lose like 6 other senators? But regardless, it is what it is. I've seen a lot though already. Like, you've started seeing kind of a liberal pivot towards acknowledging that there is going to be like a progressive threat, I say in quotations, in the upcoming midterms. And you see it a lot in primarily on Twitter, what's called like the K Hive. So like Kamala Harris, kind of her fan base or her support base online. I kind of use them as a litmus test for like broader moderate, like quasi, like, progressive by name, moderate functionally like type people. Or in my opinion, like right wing, but I mean, that is what it is. Of like, they are driving it home that we need to be more moderate, that if we go more left, we're going to lose more. They're already priming it. And I think that when we see an electoral failure in 22, especially, we're going to start seeing this whole like, oh, well, if progressives weren't asking for so damn much, we might get something done. And then, progressives are naturally going to answer that with a, well, we didn't really even ask for that much kind of call. And then you're going to get bogged down in infighting until 24. And then in 24, like, I'm sorry, but if Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg are the best the Democratic Party can field for like a solvent presidential ticket, then they're asking for failure. And it doesn't matter like what progressives do at that point. You throw up a ticket like that, it's done. You throw up a Biden Kamala Harris ticket again, it's done, in my opinion. Like, I mean, because Biden, when you look at the approval ratings and the general like trends in popularity amongst Biden and Harris, like, that administration is functionally being floated by the child tax credit that is going to be expiring before 24. And you compound that with the end of the rent moratorium. I mean, both rent and eviction moratoriums, the end of student debt moratoriums, his continued inaction towards any kind of college debt cancellation or what have you. Like, he's setting himself up for massive, massive failure. And unfortunately, I agree, is that progressives are going to be blamed for that when it's functionally a failure of Democratic Party leadership to act. And, unfortunately, a massive victory for these moderate candidates who are doing everything they can to ensure that they can stay in charge, or at least if they're not in positions of power, inadvertently wield all of the power that they need to stall anything they don't like. And I personally, it might just because of my, it might be because of my pre-existing biases here. If Democrats lose in 22 and 24, progressives are the last cohort you need to be blaming for that failure. Like, you need, like, I wish that, like, the K Hive would have that kind of energy for moderate Democrats that are holding up any kind of reforms or changes that might benefit working class people. Because like the Democrats have been outflanked by Republicans on the whole working class party narrative for years, which is only doable because the Democrats prove time and time and time again that they're a party that will functionally uphold corporate capitalist interests over any reforms that might help the working class. And Republicans are able to tout that they're a working people's party because there isn't an oppositional force that actually is. The Republican Party is by all means a corporate party, corporate capitalist party, as is the Democratic Party. And as such, like, unfortunately, like, there's just no foil. You saw that in the, the governor's race in Virginia, right? or I think it was the governor's race. Yeah, where the Democratic incumbent got his ass kicked. And, frankly, like the few points that he could have really been dragging out that weren't like your typical anti-Trump talking points that, in my opinion, are extremely tired by now and they're not going to work in another election cycle. He could have hammered the now Republican governor on his investment in massive hedge funds, on things of that nature. Like, why is he doing VC work? But unfortunately, the Democratic incumbent was also tied to some of those same funds. This is the fundamental Democratic Party issue, is they can't legitimately criticize the Republican Party for some of their most gross things because they're not offering anything beyond rhetorical difference. And they're really just offering aesthetic change, and that's the unfortunate reality with, I think, the Democratic platform as it stands, is it's much more focused on aesthetic change than functional structural change. I think the Biden administration is a really good example of that. Like, functionally, they're not all that different from the Trump admin, as much as I hate to admit it. And Kamala Harris isn't really a progressive warrior that I think the K-Hive and some moderate Democrats would paint her out to be. It really seems like we've changed the color of the party that's in charge from red to blue, but functionally for any working class voter, what's been done? Like what permanently has been done? Like you can tout the child tax credit, you can tout a less than what was promised stimulus, but if functionally all of the things that were keeping the working class like alive during this pandemic are expiring, and you're not giving other like legitimately good and dynamic policies, you shouldn't expect to win. And I don't know. And I agree with you. I think progressives are going to get blamed, voters are going to get blamed, and it's going to be a mess because the Democratic Party time and time again shows that it's more willing to blame its voters than do any serious like self-reflection post-electoral defeats. But we'll see. I don't know. That's the unfortunate reality.
I think that is the reality. I think that we're probably headed for that. We see it time and time again. Progressives can mop up and win all their races, and few moderates lose, and then it's we went too far to the left. Meanwhile, the guys that quote unquote went too far to the left are the ones that are moving their stuff into offices around the country because they won their elections, because they promised to give the working class something tangible. And I think that is probably a good place to wrap it up. I gotta say, I'm very excited for this new and improved SoleStrategies podcast. You and I both doing these things, and it's fun to have that discourse. Talking about the quote unquote Joe Manchin administration that we have been subjected to on the morning of the Build Back Better plan being essentially killed, as Joe Manchin signifies that he will not vote for it. Thank you guys for listening. It's going to be a great run, and I'm very excited to work with you more in the future, James.
Yeah, no, likewise. I'm very, very excited. But as always, I hope everybody has a great day, and I think we're out of here.